Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Oh. Chapter 1. The Great Carsely Cake Crisis. Agatha Raisin glared at the Victorian sponge cake as if it had personally insulted her. In reality, it was Agatha who felt insulted by the entire village of Carsely. She smoothed the front of her expensive tailored navy Chanel suit, which she had purchased specifically for this occasion, the first annual Carsely Grand Charity Bake-Off and Social Evening. It was intended to be her triumph, a public demonstration of her smooth transition from high-powered London PR executive to sophisticated country lady. Instead, she felt like a complete fraud, swatting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the village hall. The problem, as usual, lay with Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, whose gentle, unassuming demeanour masked a terrifying efficiency that always managed to make Agatha feel slightly inadequate. But today, the primary source of Agatha's simmering rage was sitting 3 spaces down on the long, white-clothed table. It was Penelope Penn Cartwright. Penn was everything Agatha was not, and Agatha hated her for it with the fierce intensity she usually reserved for slow drivers and people who criticized her dress sense. Penn was 30-something, effortlessly chic in a bohemian luxe way, possessing a mane of naturally chestnut hair that defied frizz, and perhaps worst of all, she was genuinely nice. Since arriving from London 6 months ago, Penn had conquered Carsely society not through ambition or PR maneuvering, but through sheer, irritating charm. And she was a magnificent baker. "Oh, Agatha," Penn said, drifting over. A vision in floaty beige linen that made Agatha feel severely overdressed. "Your sponge looks substantial, very traditional." Agatha bridled. Substantial. Was that a euphemism for heavy? Old family recipe, Agatha lied, having actually purchased it from a very exclusive bakery in Moreton in Marsh that morning, transferring it carefully to her own tin and roughing up the edges slightly to make it look rustic. "Lovely," Penn smiled, but her eyes were already scanning the crowd. "Have you seen my entry? The chocolate hazelnut truffle torte. It took all night." Agatha had seen it. It was a masterpiece, looking like something from the window of a Parisian patisserie. Agatha's rustic sponge now looked pathetic. To make matters worse, James Lacey, Agatha's handsome neighbour, retired army man, and the subject of her intensely frustrated romantic ambitions was currently standing by Penn's torte, gazing at it with the kind of reverence Agatha wished he would direct toward her. "Well," Agatha snapped, "some of us have other things to do besides fussing over ganache. We do have lives." Penn just laughed, an annoyingly tinkling sound. "You're right, Agatha. Social life in Carsely is demanding. It's hard work, but someone has to do it. Hard work." Agatha could have choked her. The room buzzed with polite conversation and the sharp scent of coffee. The judges, Mrs. Bloxby, the local doctor, and Sir Charles Frayth, who Agatha sometimes felt was the only sane person in the village, despite being a baron and remarkably cheap, were slowly making their way down the line. Agatha felt a rising panic. She needed a distraction. She needed a reason not to lose to Penelope Cartwright in a public forum. The opportunity came in the form of Roy Silver, her former assistant from London, who had recently wormed his way into a weekend invitation to her cottage. Roy, in a vibrant orange silk shirt that clashed horribly with the hall's curtains, was mingling with determined desperation. "Agatha, darling," he whispered loudly, appearing at her elbow. "Who is that woman by the punch? The one who looks like she just swallowed a bee?" Agatha followed his gaze to see Mary Debenham, a rather sour-faced woman who always dressed in sensible grey cardigans and ran the village book club with an iron fist. Mary was indeed looking unhappy, glaring fixedly at Penn Cartwright. "Tarts, Murray. She hates everyone," Agatha dismissed. "Keep quiet, Roy. The judges are coming." The judging was excruciating. They nodded at Agatha's cake, gave it a polite taste, Sir Charles taking a particularly large piece, and offered a non-committal "very nice." Agatha's heart sank. Then they reached Penn's chocolate hazelnut truffle torte. Mrs. Bloxby took a tiny bite and beamed. "Oh, Penelope, this is simply divine." Sir Charles tried it and closed his eyes in bliss. "By God, that's good. Better than the chef at the club." Agatha watched, the green-eyed monster clawing at her tailored suit. James Lacey actually clapped when Penn was declared the winner of the showstopper category. "I can't stand it," Agatha muttered to Roy. "I need some air." She pushed her way through the admiring crowd, ignoring Penn's humble bragging, "Oh, it was nothing, really," and slipped out the side door into the cool evening. The Sant, Mary's church hall parking lot, was bathed in the soft glow of a street lamp. Agatha lit a cigarette, which she wasn't supposed to be doing, but her nerves were shot. Carsely, usually so peaceful, felt suffocating. Everyone was inside, celebrating Penelope. Nobody noticed Agatha Raisin, former PR Maven, smoking in the shadows. Noticed. Agatha? She jumped, nearly dropping her cigarette. James Lacey was standing there, looking annoyingly dashing in a tweed blazer. "Oh, James," she said, trying to sound sophisticated and concealing the cigarette behind her back. "Just enjoying the quiet. Terrible business in there," James said, but he didn't mean the cake. All that fuss. It's a pity. But, he paused, looking uncomfortable. "I needed a moment away from... well, from certain people." Agatha's heart did a hopeful little skip. "Penelope?" James didn't answer directly. She can be intense, energetic. It's a bit much sometimes. Before Agatha could capitalize on this unexpected moment of vulnerability from James, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Penelope Cartwright, I know you're in here." Agatha and James peered toward the street. Stumbling down the sidewalk was Arthur Cartwright, Penn's much older husband. He was a wealthy, somewhat reclusive man who usually stayed at their sprawling manor house. Tonight, he was clearly drunk. He lurched into the parking lot. "Hiding, are you? Showing off your talents?" Agatha, senses piqued by a potential scandal, felt a rush of professional satisfaction. This was much more interesting than cake. "James," Agatha whispered urgently, "we should probably go back in and warn Mrs. Bloxby. He's making a scene." James looked conflicted, ever the proper gentleman. "I don't think..." But Agatha was already moving, anticipation replacing her jealousy. The second annual Carsely Bake-Off might be a disaster, but the social fallout promised to be exquisite. She opened the hall door. The noise of celebration poured out. Penn was just cutting another slice of her winning tort for Mrs. Bloxby, everyone, Agatha announced, raising her voice with her best PR authority. "I believe Arthur Cartwright has arrived and he seems somewhat distressed." The room went silent. Penn's smile froze. Through the doorway, Arthur's voice boomed. "Penn! Get out here!" Mrs. Bloxby, recovering quickly, began to guide Penn toward the door. The village watched, a collective gossipy intake of breath. This was better than television. Then, the sudden silence inside the hall was broken by a different noise from outside. A strange, choking gargle. And then, nothing. Agatha, who was closest to the door, frowned. "James? Is everything all right?" James, who had gone outside to see what Arthur wanted, didn't answer. Agatha pushed past Mrs. Bloxby and stepped back out into the parking lot. Arthur Cartwright was lying on the pavement next to his large, dark Jaguar. James was kneeling beside him. "James?" Agatha asked, her annoyance turning into something colder. James looked up, his face pale in the lamplight. He looked at Agatha, then at Mrs. Bloxby, who had followed Agatha out, and then at Penn Cartwright, who was now standing, pale and shaking, in the doorway. "He's dead," James said simply. Agatha stared at the body of Arthur Cartwright, the drunk, angry husband who had arrived moments ago. Her plans for social triumph, her resentment of Penn, her annoyance at the villagate, all seemed to evaporate in the chill air. Murder had come to Carsely, and Agatha Raisin, despite her initial annoyance, already knew that her quiet country life was about to become very, very inconvenient, and infinitely more interesting. Chapter 2. Death and digestives. By the time Detective Sergeant Bill Wong arrived, the Carsely Village Hall parking lot looked like a film set, albeit one with a very low budget and a cast of terrified pensioners. Arthur Cartwright lay beneath a crisp white tablecloth donated reluctantly by the catering committee while his widow, Penelope, was being revived with smelling salts and sweet tea in the back of Mrs. Bloxby's Morris Minor. Agatha stood by her own car, shivering in her Chanel suit. The crisp night air was doing nothing for her mood. She felt a strange mixture of genuine shock and a burgeoning, slightly shameful excitement. "Terrible business, Agatha," Bill Wong said, stepping over to her. He was a young, round-faced man of Chinese descent who had the unfortunate habit of treating Agatha like a favorite, albeit eccentric, aunt. Heart attack, most likely. The man was shouting, he was drunk, and he was 65. It's a recipe for disaster. He didn't look like he was having a heart attack, Agatha snapped, her PR instincts kicking in. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. One minute he was bellowing about talents, and the next he was gargling. Bill sighed, scribbling in a notebook. "The doctor will confirm it. For now it's a sudden death. Not a crime scene, Agatha. Don't start." Agatha watched him walk away. Not a crime scene. That was exactly what the police always said before they found out someone had been poisoned with hemlock or garroted with a piano wire. The next morning, Carsely was transformed. The picturesque honey-coloured stone cottages seemed to lean toward one another, whispering, nursing a cup of expensive coffee and a sense of profound irritation that Roy Silver was still asleep in her guest room, decided that the only way to get the real story was to go to the source of all village knowledge, the post office. She dressed carefully in a slate grey wool dress and her serious pearls. She wanted to look like a concerned neighbour, not a nosy detective. The post office was packed. Mrs. Behind the counter was holding court, and they say, Mrs. whispered, her voice carrying easily to the back of the queue where Agatha stood, that he hadn't slept at the manor for 3 nights, stayed at a hotel in Evesham, came back just to confront her. Confront her about what? Agatha interjected, stepping forward and ignoring the indignant huff of Mrs. Tarrington, who had been next in line. Oh, hello, Miss Raisin, Mrs. Her eyes glinting. The bake-off, of course. Arthur hated Penelope's social climbing. Called it a waste of his money. My sister's cousin cleans for them, and she says the rows were loud enough to wake the dead. He seemed more than just annoyed about cake last night, Agatha mused. He mentioned her talents with a very nasty sneer. Well, piped up Miss Sims from the corner, clutching a tin of cat food. Everyone knows Penelope was a dancer before she met him, on the stage, in London. The way Miss Sims said London made it sound like a den of iniquity where people danced in their undergarments. Agatha, who had lived in London for 30 years, felt a momentary urge to defend the city, but her curiosity won out. A dancer? Agatha asked. What kind of dancer? The kind that marries a man 40 years her senior for his estate, Mrs. Tarrington muttered. Ben spent his money on French chocolate and linen dresses that looked like bedsheets. Agatha felt a pang of recognition. The village had turned on Penelope Cartwright with the speed of a hungry pack of wolves. Yesterday she was the darling of the bake-off today. She was a gold-digging widow whose husband had conveniently dropped dead after a public row. The police think it was a heart attack, Agatha said, testing the waters. And I think I am the Queen of Sheba, Mrs. Mason snorted. He was fit as a flea, Arthur was. Always out walking the hounds. No, there was something funny about that death. Did you see his face, Miss Raisin? All purple and twisted. Agatha hadn't actually seen his face. James had moved her away too quickly, but she nodded anyway. It was striking. She left the shop with a loaf of bread she didn't want and a head full of questions. As she walked back toward her cottage, she saw James Lacey standing at his garden gate. He looked troubled. Agatha, he called out. Have you heard? The police have moved the body to Gloucester for a post-mortem. Apparently the attending physician wasn't happy with the symptoms of the heart attack. Agatha's heart gave a little thump. I knew it. I felt it in my bones, James. James looked at her with his cool military blue eyes. What did you feel, Agatha? Besides an opportunity to stick your nose in? Agatha bristled, her pride wounded. I am a concerned member of this community, and if a man dies in front of me while his wife is winning a trophy for a tort that tasted like wet cardboard, I have a right to be curious. James leaned against the gate. The tort was excellent, Agatha. That's the problem. Everyone is saying it was too good, that she was showing off, that she provoked him. People are jealous, James. I should know, Agatha said, then quickly corrected herself. I mean, I see it in others, but don't you think it's odd? The timing? Everything in this village is odd, Agatha, including your sudden interest in forensic pathology. He turned back to his garden, leaving Agatha standing on the pavement. She glared at his retreating back. Fine. If James wouldn't help, she'd do it herself. She had a London PR background. She knew how to find the cracks in a polished image. And Penelope Cartwright's image was about to be shattered. Chapter 3. The widow in cashmere Agatha stood before her bedroom mirror, debating between the grieving friend look and the sophisticated neighbour ensemble. She eventually settled on a black silk blouse, a charcoal pencil skirt, and a pair of oversized sunglasses that screamed discreet sympathy, or at least, that's what she told herself. You look like you're heading to a mafia funeral, Aggie, Roy Silver chirped from the doorway, clutching a piece of buttered toast. It's Agatha, and I am going to pay my respects, she snapped, grabbing her handbag. Unlike some people, I understand the importance of social protocol in a crisis. You're going to snoop, Roy corrected, grinning. Don't forget to check the medicine cabinet for vitamin V vengeance, darling. Agatha ignored him and marched out. She stopped at the local deli to buy a tin of impossibly expensive biscuits, kind that looked like they belonged in a museum, and began the trek toward Westerly House. The Cartwright estate was a sprawling golden stone manor on the edge of the village, surrounded by manicured lawns that made Agatha's own garden look like a wasteland. As she approached the heavy oak door, she felt a familiar prickle of insecurity. This was the world she had spent 30 years trying to buy her way into. Yet here she was, still feeling like a trespasser. The door was opened not by a maid, but by Penelope herself. Pen looked remarkably composed. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a loose, elegant knot, and she wore a cream cashmere cardigan that looked soft enough to melt. There were no puffy eyes, no crumpled tissues. "Agatha," Pen said, her voice low and melodic. "How kind of you to come." "I was so shocked," Agatha began, her voice taking on the practiced PR breathiness she used for difficult clients. "The whole village is devastated. I brought these... just a little something." She thrust the biscuits forward like a shield. "Thank you. Come in. I was just having some tea. I find I can't quite face the kitchen yet." Agatha followed her into a drawing room filled with antiques and the faint scent of expensive lilies. She sat on a velvet sofa, perched on the edge as if ready to spring into action. It was so sudden, Agatha prompted, leaning in. "The police, they are being very thorough, I hear." Bill Wong mentioned a post-mortem. Pen's hand, poised over a silver teapot, froze for a fraction of a second. "Yes." It seems the doctor wasn't entirely satisfied. Arthur had a temper, certainly, but he was always so robust. "And he was so angry last night," Agatha added, her eyes roaming the room. She noticed a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Arthur and Pen on a boat. Arthur looked red-faced and triumphant. Pen looked like she was trying very hard to smile. "He mentioned your talents. I assume he meant the baking." Pen gave a small, weary laugh. "Arthur hated the baking, Agatha. He thought it was middle-class posturing. He wanted me to be a quiet ornament in this house. My talents were a reference to my past. I was a dancer, you know. He never let me forget that Head rescued me from a life of touring companies and cheap hotels." "A dancer," Agatha mused. "How fascinating. Ballet, modern, high-end cabaret. It's where we met." Pen leaned back, her eyes clouding. "But Arthur was a jealous man. He didn't like me having anything of my own. Not even a blue ribbon for a tort." Agatha felt a strange, unwanted pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to be defined by a man's expectations. But then she remembered the way James Lacey had looked at the tort, and her sympathy evaporated. "Is there anyone else staying with you?" Agatha asked, trying to sound casual. "Family?" I saw a strange car in the drive. Pen's expression shifted. It was subtly a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes. "Just Arthur's nephew, Miles. He arrived this morning to help with the arrangements." "How helpful," Agatha said, her internal alarm bells ringing. "I didn't know Arthur had a nephew." "Neither did I, until 3 years ago," Pen said softly. "He's a bit of a wanderer. Arthur wasn't fond of him, but Miles is the only blood relative left. He stands to inherit the bulk of the estate, actually. Everything that isn't he tied up in my trust." Motive, Agatha thought, the word flashing in her mind like a neon sign. At that moment the door opened and a man walked in. He was in his late 20s, with sandy hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was wearing a barber jacket that looked brand new. "Aunt Penelope," he said, his voice smooth and slightly mocking. "I didn't realize we had company." Agatha Raisin, a neighbor, Pen introduced them. Miles Cartwright. Miles walked over and took Agatha's hand, kissing her knuckles with a flourish that Agatha found both charming and deeply suspicious. "A pleasure, Mrs. Raisin. It's heartening to see the village rally around. My uncle was a difficult man, but he deserved a better end than a parking lot." "He certainly did," Agatha said, reclaiming her hand. "And he seemed so healthy, right up until the moment he wasn't." Miles smiled, a slow, knowing thing. "Life is fragile, isn't it? 1 minute you're shouting about cake, the next, poof." He turned to Pen. "The solicitor is on the phone, Penny. He wants to talk about the inventory. Seems Uncle Arthur was quite meticulous about his collection." Agatha watched Pen's face. The widow had gone very pale. "The collection? But that's for later, Miles." "He's quite insistent," Miles shrugged, then turned back to Agatha. "Y'all have to excuse us, Mrs. Raisin. Death brings out the bean counters." Agatha was ushered out with practiced politeness. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, she stood on the gravel drive, her mind racing. The nephew was far too comfortable. Pen was far too nervous about an inventory. And Arthur Cartwright had died exactly when his public behavior was at its most embarrassing. She took out her phone and dialed James Lacey. "James," she said as soon as he picked up. "I've just been to the manor. There's a nephew, a very slippery nephew. And something about a collection that has Penelope Cartwright looking like she's seen a ghost. Agatha, James sighed. In the middle of cleaning my gutters. Forget the gutters, James. There's a fortune at stake, a jealous husband, and a dancer in a cashmere cardigan. Meet me at the Red Lion in 20 minutes. It's time we did some real investigating. She didn't wait for him to argue. She had a mystery to solve. And more importantly, she had a reason to make James Lacey pay for her gin and tonic. Chapter 4. The archive of indiscretions. The Red Lion was the beating heart of Carsely's gossip mill, a place where secrets were traded over pints of bitter and packets of pork scratchings. Agatha sat in a corner booth, her foot tapping a rhythmic, impatient tattoo against the table leg. She had already finished one gin and tonic strictly, for her nervous hand was eyeing the door with the ferocity of a hawk. When James Lacey finally appeared, he looked windswept and thoroughly bored. He sat across from her, smelling faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. "You're late, James," Agatha snapped, checking her gold Cartier watch. "I've been sitting here like a wallflower. I told you, Agatha, the gutters were a priority. Besides, the police are handling it. Bill Wong mentioned Thea waiting on toxicology." James signaled to the barman for a pint. "What is this collection you're so worked up about?" Penelope looked terrified the moment Miles mentioned it. Agatha whispered, leaning across the sticky table. It wasn't just furniture or silver. It sounded ominous. And Miles. He's like a cat that's found the key to the dairy. He's far too smug for a grieving relative. "Hello, you two. Plotting a revolution or just the usual village uprising?" Agatha jumped. Sir Charles Fraith was looming over them, looking dishevelled in a moth-eaten sweater that probably cost more than Agatha's car. Charles was a baronet, a rogue, and remarkably tight-fisted, but he knew everyone's business from Evesham to London. "We're discussing Arthur Cartwright," Agatha said, pulling out a chair for him. "Charles, you knew him." "What was this collection he kept?" Charles' expression shifted from playful to uncharacteristically grim. He sat down, leaning in close. The archive. Arthur was a man of peculiar hobbies. He didn't just collect Victorian snuff boxes, Agatha. He collected people. "What do you mean?" James asked, his interest finally piqued. "Arthur was a genealogist by trade, but a voyeur by nature," Charles explained, lowering his voice. "He spent years digging into the backgrounds of everyone who moved into the area. He called it social vetting. He had files, Agatha. Deep, dark files on everyone's past. Bankruptcies, scandalous divorces, illegitimate children, even the odd criminal record hidden under a name change." Agatha felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She thought of her own past PR firm, the slightly dubious family history Shed invented when she first moved to Carsely. The fact that Shed once been arrested for a very minor shoplifting incident in her rebellious youth. Shed only wanted the lipstick after all. "He had files on the village?" Agatha whispered. "The nightmare folder, he called it," Charles nodded. "He used to hint at it during parish meetings whenever someone disagreed with him. It was a silent threat. I know who you were before you wore that barber jacket, that sort of thing. It's why half the village hated him, and the other half feared him. And now Miles has the keys to the study," James mused. "A blackmailer's dream." "But wait," Agatha said, her mind whirring. "If the police find that archive, everyone's secrets come out. But if the murderer got to it first, then the motive is buried," James finished. The pub door swung open, and the room suddenly went quiet. Mary Debenham, the sour-faced book club leader, walked in. She looked even more pinched than usual, her eyes darting toward Agatha's table before she hurried to the bar to order a medicinal sherry. Mary looked like she wanted to murder Arthur during the bake-off, Agatha noted. She kept staring at Penelope's tort like it was a hand grenade. "Mary's father was a local magistrate," Charles whispered. "Arthur apparently found something about the old man's investments that didn't sit well with the law. He's been lording it over her for years." Agatha scanned the room. Mrs. from the post office was whispering to Miss Sims. Even the barman seemed on edge. The air in the Red Lion was thick with a new kind of tension, not just the shock of death, but the terror of exposure. "I need to get into that study," Agatha announced, standing up so abruptly she nearly knocked over Gemma's pint. "Agatha, no," James warned. "That's breaking and entering, or at least highly improper. I'm not breaking in, James. I'm going to offer my services as a PR consultant to Penelope. She's a widow in crisis. She needs someone to manage the image of the estate." Agatha straightened her blazer, her eyes flashing with determination. "And if I happen to see where they keep the nightmare folder, all the better. You're going to get caught," Charles chuckled, "and then I'll have to bail you out. And I'm notoriously short of cash this month, Aggie. I won't get caught, Agatha said, though her stomach gave a nervous flip. Im art professionnel. As she walked out of the pub, she didn't see the dark car parked across the street, its engine idling. She didn't notice the driver watching her with a very focused, very unfriendly intensity. Agatha Raisin was too busy planning her next move, unaware that in a village full of secrets, the person who goes looking for the truth is often the one who ends up with a target on their back. Chapter 5. The professional touch. Agatha Raisin did not merely walk up a driveway, she conquered it. For her return to Westerly House, she had swapped her mafia funeral look for a power suit in a shade of crimson that practically screamed executive authority. If she was going to talk her way into a dead man's private sanctum, she needed to look like she could handle a hostile takeover. She didn't ring the bell this time. She used the heavy brass knocker with a rhythmic, demanding thud. The door was opened by Miles Cartwright. He had discarded his barber jacket for a cashmere sweater that looked suspiciously like the one Penn had been wearing earlier. He held a glass of amber liquid that Agatha's expert nose identified as Arthur's 30-year-old Macallon. "Back so soon, Mrs. Raisin?" Miles asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm afraid we're fresh out of biscuits." Agatha gave him a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "I am here on business, Miles. I've been thinking about Penelope. The press will be descending on this village within 24 hours. Former dancer and the mystery of the bake-off death. It's a tabloid dream. She needs a crisis management expert, and luckily for her, the best in the business lives just down the road." Miles laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "A crisis manager? In Carsely? It's a bit grand, isn't it?" "Reputation is never too grand, young man," Agatha snapped, pushing past him into the hall. "Where is she?" Penelope was in the morning room, looking frayed. The inventory Miles had mentioned earlier seemed to be taking its toll. Edges were spread across the table, and Penn looked like she hadn't slept. "Agatha?" Penn looked up, blinking. "Penelope, darling," Agatha cooed, dropping into a chair and instantly taking charge. "I've realized you're in a terrible position. The village is already whispering, and once the Gloucestershire echo gets wind of Arthur's colourful past, Yow'll be besieged. You need someone to handle the narrative. I'm offering my services pro bono as a friend." "The narrative?" Penn looked confused. "Exactly. We need to control what information gets out, especially regarding Arthur's collections." Agatha leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I understand he kept quite a few private records in his study. To protect you, I should probably help you catalogue them before the police decide to seize everything." Penelope's eyes darted toward Miles, who was standing in the doorway, watching them like a hawk. "The study is... It's locked, Agatha. Miles and I were just looking for the key." "Locked?" Agatha's eyebrows shot up. "Arthur didn't keep it on him?" "He usually had it on his watch chain," Miles interjected, swirling his scotch. "But it wasn't there when the doctor examined him. And it's not in his dressing room." Agatha felt a surge of adrenaline. A missing key meant someone had already taken it, or Arthur had hidden it from the very people now standing in his house. "Well," Agatha said, standing up with a briskness she didn't quite feel, "I have a knack for finding things. I used to find missing press releases in the middle of London blackouts. Penelope, why don't you go lie down? I'll have a look around the hall and the study door. Sometimes these old houses have spare keys hidden in the most obvious places." The guise of PR assessment, Agatha managed to usher a reluctant Miles toward the kitchen to make Penelope some herbal tea. The moment he was out of sight, she scurried toward the back of the house, where Arthur's study lay behind a heavy mahogany door. The door was indeed locked. Agatha tried the handles on it. She peered through the oversized keyhole but could see nothing but darkness. Then she noticed something. On the polished floorboards, just inches from the door, was a faint, circular scratch. She knelt, her Chanel-clad knees protesting. The scratch looked fresh. It was as if something heavy had been dragged or someone had been kneeling here recently, perhaps fumbling with a lock they weren't supposed to be touching. She stood up and looked at a large, ugly Victorian umbrella stand nearby. She poked around inside, finding nothing but a dusty walking stick. Then she checked the top of the doorframe. Her fingers met only dust and a spider that she suppressed a scream over. "Looking for something, Agatha?" She whirled around. It wasn't Miles. It was Bill Wong, standing at the end of the corridor, looking remarkably unimpressed. "Bill, I was just checking the moldings," Agatha lied, her face flushing crimson to match her suit. "This house is full of dry rot. I was telling Penelope she needs a surveyor. In the middle of a murder investigation." Bill walked toward her, his shoes clicking on the wood. "The toxicology came back, Agatha. It wasn't a heart attack. Arthur Cartwright was poisoned." Agatha's heart skipped. Poisoned? How? Akhenaten, Bill said grimly. Wolfsbane. It's fast-acting and mimics the symptoms of a coronary if the dose is right. He must have ingested it shortly before he went outside. The tort! Agatha cried, a hideous sense of triumph rising in her. Penelope's tort. I knew it. The tort was tested. Bill sighed. It was clean. So was the punch. Everyone ate the cake, Agatha. Only Arthur died. Agatha frowned, but he was shouting at her. He didn't have time to eat anything once he arrived. That's the puzzle, Bill said, eyeing the locked study door. We're waiting for the search warrant to get into his files. We think the key might be inside. Or, Agatha whispered, looking at the circular scratch on the floor, someone's already been in there and taken what they were looking for. Bill followed her gaze. You might be right for once, Agatha, but stay out of it. This isn't a PR crisis. This is a killer who knows their botany. As Bill led her back toward the front door, Agatha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Cotswold wind. If the tort was clean, how had Arthur been poisoned? And more importantly, if the key was missing, who was currently holding the nightmare folderand, whose secret were they planning to use next? Chapter 6. The poison in the perennials. Agatha spent the following morning in a state of high-octane agitation. She had spent half the night scouring her gardening books, not that she actually gardened, preferring to pay a local man named Hodgins to do the heavy lifting looking for Akhenaten. Wolfsbane, she muttered, pacing her kitchen in a silk robe that had seen better days. Monkshade, purple flowers, looks like a little helmet. Deadly, beautiful, and apparently common in the Cotswolds. Roy Silver, who was nursing a hangover with a plate of overpriced smoked salmon, looked up. It sounds like a gothic novel, Aggie. Are you sure you shouldn't just leave it to that nice Bill Wong? Or you're going to get soil under your nails. The police are looking for a motive, Roy. I'm looking for the means, Agatha said, her eyes narrowing. Everyone in this village has a motive to want Arthur Cartwright dead. If that nightmare folder exists, he was basically holding a gun to the village's collective head. But who had the plant? She knew exactly where to start. The Carsely Ladies' Garden Committee meeting, which was being held at the vicarage that afternoon. If there was any illicit flora being traded in the village, the garden committee would know about it. The vicarage was a sprawling, comfortable house that always smelled of beeswax and Mrs. Bloxby's baking. Today, however, the atmosphere was strained. The ladies sat in a circle of floral-patterned chairs, sipping tea with a funereal solemnity. It's just so inconvenient, Miss Sims was saying as Agatha walked in. The open garden day is next week. How can we possibly show off our delphiniums with a murder hanging over us? Technically, Agatha interrupted, dropping into a chair next to Mrs. Bloxby. It's a poisoning, much more sophisticated than a common murder. Does anyone here grow monkshade? The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Mary Debenham, who was clutching a clipboard as if it were a holy relic, went a peculiar shade of grey. That is a very pointed question, Agatha, Mary said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a traditional cottage garden plant. Many people grow it. I have a stand of it myself, near the back fence. And has anyone borrowed any lately? Agatha asked, her eyes fixed on Mary's hands. Mary was wearing gardening glovey 7 inside the vicarage. Tidying up, Mary? Or perhaps hiding a gap in the border? Oh, what you're implying, Mary snapped. But Arthur Cartwright was a vile man. He was planning to publish a history of Carsely that was nothing more than a collection of lies and smears about our families. Including yours, Mary, Agatha pushed, ignoring Mrs. Bloxby's warning look. I heard your father had some legal troubles toward the end. Mary stood up so abruptly her tea slopped into the saucer. My father was a saint. Arthur was a blackmailer. He deserved whatever he got. She turned and fled the room, her sensible shoes clattering on the hallway floor. Agatha, really, Mrs. Bloxby sighed. The poor woman is under a great deal of stress. We're all under stress, Agatha retorted. There's a killer among us, and everyone is worried about their delphiniums. The meeting dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs. Agatha, feeling she had hit a nerve, decided to follow Mary. She slipped out of the vicarage and hurried down the lane toward Mary's cottage, a small, vine-covered building that looked like something from a fairy talafi. The fairy tale involved a very angry witch. As Agatha approached the gate, she saw a figure ducking behind a hedge in Mary's back garden. It wasn't Mary. It was Miles Cartwright. He was holding a small trowel and a plastic bag. He looked up, saw Agatha, and froze. For a second, the mask of the charming nephew slipped, revealing something cold and calculating. Collecting more evidence, Miles, Agatha called out, pushing open the gate. Just a souvenir, Mrs., recovering quickly and tucking the bag into his pocket. Mary said I could take some cuttings for the manor garden in memory of Uncle Arthur. Cuttings of wolfsbane? Agatha asked, stepping closer. That's a very dangerous memorial. It's a beautiful plant, Miles said, his smile not reaching his eyes. And beauty, as you know, often has a sting. He brushed past her, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and damp earth. Agatha watched him go, then turned her attention to the garden. The monkshood was there, all regal, and very purple. But as Agatha leaned in to look closer, she noticed something odd. A small, handwritten note was pinned to a nearby stake. It wasn't a gardening tip. It was a single sentence written in a cramped, angry hand. The debt is paid. Stay out of the study. Agatha reached for the note, but before her fingers could touch it, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the garden. A flower pot on the ledge beside her head shattered into 1,000 pieces. Agatha screamed and dove for the dirt. Her Chanel suit be damned. She didn't wait to see if there was a second shot. She scrambled toward the gate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Someone was watching. Someone was protecting the nightmare folder. And for the first time in the investigation, Agatha Raisin realized that she wasn't just an observer, she was a target. Chapter 7, Brandy, Bullets, and the belligerent vicar Agatha Raisin didn't run, she scurried with a desperate, ungraceful urgency that felt entirely beneath her dignity. Her heels sank into the soft Cotswold turf, and she could feel a smear of garden mulch ruining the hem of her crimson trousers. By the time she reached James Lacey's garden gate, she was panting, her hair usually a perfect chestnut bob looking like a hedge that had lost a fight with a lawnmower. She didn't knock. She burst through the front door shouting, "James, I've been assassinated, or very nearly." James Lacey was in his study, surrounded by maps and historical journals. He looked up, his expression shifting from mild irritation to genuine alarm as he saw Agatha's dishevelled state. "Agatha? What on earth? You've got a leaf in your ear." "A leaf?" "James, I've been shot at. By a sniper. In Murray Debenham's garden." She collapsed into a leather armchair, clutching her chest. "A flower pot was sacrificed in my place. I need a drink. A large one. Preferably something that burns." James sighed, but he moved to the sideboard and poured her a generous splash of brandy. A sniper. In Carsely. It was likely just a stone flicked up by a passing car, or a particularly aggressive pigeon. "Pigeons do not shatter terracotta with ballistic precision," Agatha snapped, gulping the brandy. The fire of the alcohol helped settle her nerves, but not her temper. Someone was watching me. And Miles Cartwright was there, James, sneaking around with a bag of wolfsbane. He looked at me like I was a budget deficit he was looking to cut. James sat opposite her, his face uncharacteristically grave. "Agatha, you have to stop. You're poking a hornet's nest with a very short stick. This nightmare folder isn't just village gossip. If it exists, people will kill to keep it shut. And what about you, James?" Agatha's eyes sharpened. Her fear was quickly being replaced by her natural nosy instincts. "You've been awfully quiet about Arthur. You were in the army. You're a man of the world. Did Arthur have something on you?" Jimmy's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the window. "Don't be ridiculous." "Is it ridiculous?" Agatha stood up, her pride stung by his dismissal. She began to pace the room, her eyes roaming over his desk. And then she saw it. Tucked under a heavy paperweight was an envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same cramped, aggressive script she'd seen on the note in Mary's garden. Before James could stop her, Agatha snatched it. "Agatha, put that down." She ignored him, ripping the letter out. It was brief. "Lacey, the Cyprus business isn't as buried as you think. I suggest you reconsider your opposition to the new manor boundary. My files are very patient." Agatha stared at the paper. "The Cyprus business?" "James, what is this?" James looked older suddenly, the sunlight catching the grey at his temples. He snatched the letter back, his face a mask of cold fury. "It's nothing. An old administrative error from my time in the service. Arthur was a bottom feeder, Agatha. He thrived on finding small cracks and making them look like canyons. I wasn't going to let him blackmail me into giving up my land." "So you had a motive," Agatha whispered, a cold lump forming in her stomach. "You had a motive to want him gone." "Half the village did," James barked. "But I didn't kill him. Now, if you're quite finished accusing your neighbours, I think we should check on the vicar. Mrs. Bloxby called while you were being assassinated. Apparently the vicar is in a terrible state." Agatha felt a pang of guilt, followed quickly by a surge of curiosity. "Mr. Bloxby. Is it his gout? She wouldn't say. Only that he's unwell and behaving quite strangely. They walked to the vicarage in a tense silence. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long, skeletal shadows across the churchyard. When they arrived, Mrs. Bloxby met them at the door, her face pale. "Ah, thank goodness you're here. He's in the study. He won't let the doctor in, and he's destroying things." They hurried inside. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the vicar's sanctum. Agatha pushed past James and threw open the door. The Reverend Alf Bloxby, usually a man of stern, quiet authority, was standing in the middle of a wreckage of books. He was holding a bottle of church sherry in one hand and a handful of torn papers in the other. His face was a terrifying shade of plum. "Lies," the vicar bellowed, spotting them. "All of it. The man was a demon. He claimed I didn't even have a degree from Oxford. Said ID forged my credentials in the 60s. Alf, dear, please, Mrs. Bloxby whimpered from the doorway. "He sent me a sample," the vicar cried, waving a sheet of paper. "A sample of his research. He said if I didn't support the manor's bid for the village green, he'd send the rest to the bishop." Agatha stepped forward, her PR brain clicking into gear. "Mr. Bloxby, calm down. Where is the sample?" The vicar threw the paper at her. Agatha caught it. It wasn't a research paper. It was a photocopied page from a private ledger, detailing a series of donations made to the church 30 years ago, donations that appeared to have been redirected into a private account. "It was for the roof," the vicar sobbed, suddenly collapsing into his chair. "The roof was falling in. I only borrowed it. I paid it back." Agatha looked at James. The nightmare folder wasn't just a rumour. It was a weapon of mass social destruction. And the vicar, in his rage and shame, had just finished a pot of tea that had been left on his desk by an anonymous well-wisher. Suddenly the vicar gasped, clutching his throat. He began to cough a wet, choking sound that Agatha recognized with a jolt of pure terror. "The tea!" Agatha shrieked, lunging for the teapot. "Ah! James, don't let him drink any more." But it was too late. The vicar slumped forward, the smell of bitter almonds and something earthy filling the room. The second accident had arrived, and this time, the killer had struck at the very heart of Carsely's morality. "Oh."
Chapter 8, The Silence of the Sheep. Do something,
James. "Don't just stand there looking like a stunned pheasant," Agatha shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. James Lacey, galvanized by her scream, lunged forward. He shoved the paperwork aside and hauled the vicar from his chair, laying him flat on the Persian rug. Mrs. Bloxby stood frozen in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, making a small, whimpering sound that tore at Agatha's usually well-armoured heart. "He's still breathing," James grunted, his fingers pressed to Alf Bloxby's neck. "Agatha, call an ambulance." Now, Agatha didn't need telling twice. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers slick with a cold sweat that threatened her grip. As she barked directions at the emergency operator using her London command, Voicish watched the vicar's face. It was no longer plum-coloured, it had faded to a sickly, translucent grey. Within 10 minutes, the quiet lanes of Carsely were shattered by the wail of sirens. Blue lights strobed against the ancient stone of the vicarage, casting long, demonic shadows. Paramedics swarmed the room, pushing Agatha and James into the hallway. Detective Sergeant Bill Wong arrived shortly after, looking like a man who hadn't slept since the previous decade. He didn't even look at Agatha as he walked past. He went straight to the teapot. "Don't touch that," Agatha called out, her bossiness returning as her terror receded. "It's the tea. An anonymous well-wisher brought it. It's the wolfsbane again, Bill. I'd bet my pension on it." Bill turned, his expression weary. "Your pension is safe, Agatha. The paramedics say the symptoms match. If he survives, it'll be a miracle." "Survival isn't enough," Agatha snapped, her eyes flashing. This is an attack on the very soul of the village. First Arthur, now the vicar. Who's next, Mrs. Mason, the postman? Me? "Agatha, please," James said, taking her arm. "Let the police work. The police are working themselves into a stalemate," Agatha retorted, shaking him off. "They are looking for a killer, but they should be looking for a librarian. This is all about those files, Bill. Someone is using Arthur's nightmare folder as a shopping list for murder." By midnight, the village of Carsely had effectively gone into lockdown. No one was in the Red Lion. No one was walking their dogs. The honey-coloured cottages looked like fortresses, their curtains drawn tight against the night. The news that the vicar had been poisoned and was currently in a coma at Gloucester Royal had turned the village's usual gossipy curiosity into a cold, paralyzing dread. Agatha sat in her kitchen, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan that did nothing to stop her shivering. Roy Silver had finally realized the gravity of the situation and was uncharacteristically quiet, making Agatha a piece of toast she couldn't bring herself to eat. "It's not just about secrets anymore, Roy," Agatha whispered, staring at the crumbs on her plate. "The killer isn't just trying to keep their own past hidden. Thea using Arthur's research to settle every grudge in the village. Thea playing God with a filing cabinet. But who would know where the files are?" Roy asked. "You said the study was locked." The circular scratch, Agatha reminded him, her mind clicking back to the mahogany door. Someone dragged something. Or someone was looking for a floorboard safe. If Arthur was as paranoid as Charles says, he wouldn't just leave a nightmare folder sitting on a desk. He'd have it somewhere secure. Somewhere only he or someone very close to him could reach. She thought of Penelope in her cashmere looking fragile. She thought of Miles and his smug, sandy-haired arrogance. And then she thought of Mary Debenham, whose garden was a pharmacy of poisons. "I need to go back to the manor," Agatha announced, standing up so suddenly her chair scraped loudly. "Now? Aggie, it's pitch black and there's a poisoner on the loose," Roy cried. "The police are busy at the vicarage and the hospital. The manor will be quiet. Penelope will be a loner with Miles." Agatha grabbed her handbag, her jaw set in a line of grim determination. "If that folder is still in that house, I'm going to find it before the killer finishes the alphabet." She didn't take her car, she didn't want the headlights to give her away. She walked the back way, through the churchyard and across the lower meadow. The air was damp and smelled of rotting leaves. Every rustle in the hedgerow made her heart skip a beat, but her fierce, stubborn pride of Agatha Raisin pushed her forward. As she reached the perimeter of the Cartwright estate, she saw a light flickering in the upper window of the study. It wasn't the steady glow of a lamp. It was the erratic, bouncing beam of a flashlight. Someone was inside the locked room, and they weren't waiting for a search warrant. Agatha crept toward the side of the house, her breath hitching. She reached the heavy stone porch and pressed herself against the wall. The front door was slightly ajar. She should call Bill. She should call James. She should at the very least have brought a heavy umbrella. But Agatha Raisin was never one for shoulds. She pushed the door open, the hinges giving a faint, traitorous creak, and stepped into the darkness of the hall. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the thudding of her own heart. She began to climb the stairs, one agonizingly slow step at a time, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the study door. She reached the landing and paused. From inside the room she heard the sound of metal scraping against stone. And then, a voicier, low, satisfied chuckle that sent a wave of pure ice down her spine. "Found you," the voice whispered. Agatha's hand went to the door handle. She knew she was being impulsive. She knew she was being reckless. But as she turned the knob, she had one overriding thought. If I solve this before James Lacey, hell never hear the end of it. Chapter 9. The shadow in the sanctuary Agatha Raisin's hand trembled on the heavy brass knob of the study door. Every instinct for self-preservation few she possessed screamed at her to turn back, to run to James, or at least to find a sturdy fire-poker. But her pride was a far more demanding mistress than her fear. She took a breath, channeled the spirit of a London boardroom shark, and shoved the door open. The room was bathed in the ghostly narrow beam of a high-powered torch. The light was focused on a gaping hole in the floorboards where a section of the oak had been neatly pried away. "Going somewhere with those, or do you need a hand with the heavy lifting?" Agatha snapped, her voice coming out higher and more brittle than she intended. The figure by the hole froze. The torch beam whipped around, blinding Agatha. She squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Agatha Raisin," a voice sighed. It wasn't the menacing growl of a killer, it was a tone of profound, weary irritation. The light lowered, and Agatha's vision cleared. Standing over the cavity in the floor was Penelope Cartwright. Gone was the fragile widow in cashmere. She was wearing dark leggings, a navy turtleneck, and a pair of sturdy work gloves. In her hand she clutched a thick, accordion-style leather dossier. "Penelope," Agatha gasped. You're the one? You poisoned Arthur? And the vicar?" Penelope stepped back, the torchlight catching the sharp, desperate angles of her face. "Poisoned? Agatha? Don't be a fool. I'm trying to save this village, not kill it." "Then why are you lurking in the dark like a common thief?" Agatha demanded, regaining her footing and crossing her arms. "The vicar is in a coma, Penelope. He was poisoned by Arthur's research." "I know," Penelope hissed, stepping closer. "That's why I had to get this." Arthur didn't just keep files, Agatha. He kept a schedule. He was a sadist. He had timed letters to go out, revelations to be delivered to the bishop, the tax office, the palace all set to trigger if he didn't check in with his solicitor every 48 hours. He called it his life insurance. I am trying to find the rest of the triggers before more people are destroyed. Agatha blinked. So you didn't kill him? I hated him, Penelope said, her voice trembling with a raw, cold honesty. He was a bully and a blackmailer. But I didn't kill him. I wanted a divorce, not a murder investigation. If ID killed him, do you think ID leave his nightmare folder where his vulture of a nephew could find it? Miles, Agatha whispered. He was in the garden. He had the wolfsbane. Miles doesn't care about the secrets, Penelope said, clutching the leather folder to her chest. He only cares about the money. Oh. He thinks there's a second will hidden in Huron that leaves the entire estate to him instead of the trust. Suddenly the floorboards in the hallway groaned. Both women froze. The silence of the house felt heavy, suffocating. Then, a slow, deliberate clapping sound echoed from the doorway. Very good, Aunt Penelope, Miles Cartwright said, stepping into the room. He wasn't holding a torch. He reached out and flicked the wall switch. The sudden glare of the overhead chandelier made everyone wince. Miles was holding a small, silver-plated pistol. He looked remarkably relaxed, almost bored. I must say, Mrs., your timing is impeccable, Miles remarked. You've saved me the trouble of digging through the dust myself. I'll take that folder now, Penny. You killed him, Agatha said, her voice surprisingly steady. You poisoned your own uncle. You knew about his temper. You knew he was going to the bake-off to cause a scene, and you— What? Smeared the poison on his car door? His flask? The car door handle, Miles said with a thin smile. Simple, effective, and quite traditional. Arthur always grabbed the handle with his bare hand before reaching for his cigarettes. A bit of aconitine gel, a little skin absorption, and by the time he's finished shouting at the bake-off, his heart decides to quit. The vicar was just a happy accident. I needed a distraction to get the police away from the house so I could find the floorboards safe. You're a monster, Penelope whispered. I'm an heir, Miles corrected, and I'm not letting a few dusty secrets stand in the way of my inheritance. Now, the folder. Agatha looked at Penelope, then at Miles. Oh. She felt a surge of that old, reckless Agatha Raisin spirit, one that had once convinced a top-tier fashion editor that neon orange was the new black. You know, Miles, Agatha said, stepping forward, there's something you haven't considered. In RP Erikspat. I know how to spin a story. And right now, the story is that you're standing in a room with two witnesses and a very loud gun. Even in the Cotswolds, people notice gunshots. I don't need a gun for you, Agatha, Miles sneered, leveling the pistol at her. The village will just think you and Penelope had a falling out. A tragic accident. Two women, one folder, a steep staircase. Wait, Agatha cried, her mind racing. There's a file on you in there, Miles, Arthur told me. He said you weren't even a Cartwright. He said you were a fraud he picked up in London to irritate the taxman. It was a total Lear classic Raisin bluff, but it worked. Miles' eyes flickered to the folder for a fraction of a second. What? He hissed. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Agatha did something entirely unladylike. She grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from Arthur's desk and hurled it with all her might at the chandelier. The room exploded into darkness and shattering glass. Run, Penelope, Agatha screamed, grabbing the widow's arm and charging blindly toward where she remembered the door to be. Chapter 10, the social execution of Miles Cartwright. Agatha and Penelope plunged into the hallway just as a bullet shattered the mahogany doorframe, sending splinters raining down on Agatha's already ruined crimson suit. The sheer, deafening crack of the gunshot erased any lingering sense of village decorum. Agatha didn't just run, she sprinted with the feral desperation of a woman who refused to die before she had completely paid off her mortgage. Out the front! Make for the green, Agatha bellowed, hauling Penelope along by the elbow. They burst through the heavy oak doors and into the biting Cotswold night. The gravel of the driveway was catastrophic for Agatha's Italian leather pumps, but she ignored the pain. Behind them they could hear Miles cursing, his heavy footsteps pounding in pursuit. He was younger and faster, but Agatha had the distinct advantage of absolute white-hot fury. They tore down the lane, the lights of the village centre glowing like a beacon. The commotion at the vicarage had drawn half of Carsely out of their beds. A small crowd, including a very weary Detective Sergeant Bill Wong and an anxious James Lacey, was clustered outside the Red Lion. Agatha burst into the wash of the street lamps like an avenging, slightly dishevelled angel. Bill, Agatha shrieked, her voice cutting through the night air, freezing the villagers in their tracks. "Arrest that cashmere-clad sociopath." A second later, Miles Cartwright skidded onto the green. He stopped dead, chest heaving, his hand instinctively trying to shove the silver-plated pistol into his jacket pocket, but it was too late. 50 pairs of Cotswold eyes were locked onto the weapon. Bill Wong's hand dropped instantly to his radio. "Armed police, stand down, Cartwright. Put your hands on your head." Miles looked at the crowd, then at the police officer, his charming facade finally crumbling into a mask of ugly, cornered panic. "She's hysterical," he shouted, pointing at Agatha. "She broke into my house. They were trying to steal my uncle's property." "Oh, do shut up, Miles. You're embarrassing yourself," Agatha panted, stepping forward, straightening her blazer with a supreme effort of will. This was her stage now. "You murdered Arthur. You smeared aconitine gel on his car door handle because you knew his routine. You knew he'd touch it, storm into the bake-off, and drop dead in public. And then you poisoned the poor vicar's tea just to get the police out of the manor so you could dig up the floorboards." The village erupted into shocked gasps. Mrs. Mason clutched her chest, and even Sir Charles Fraith, standing near the pub door, looked genuinely stunned. "He wanted the nightmare folder," Agatha declared loudly, ensuring the entire village heard. Penelope stepped up beside her, holding the thick leather accordion file high in the air. "He wanted to destroy the trust and blackmail this village to line his own pockets." Miles sneered, realizing the game was up. "You stupid, interfering cow. You think you're so clever." "I am a PR professional," Agatha said coldly, "and your public image is officially ruined." Two uniformed officers, drawn by Bill's radio call, flanked Miles and forced him roughly to the gravel. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the tension that had strangled Carsely for days seemed to evaporate, replaced instantly by a furious, buzzing wave of gossip. James Lacey stepped through the crowd, his eyes moving from the arrested Miles to Agatha. He looked bewildered, relieved, and grudgingly impressed. "Agatha," he said softly, "you could have been killed." "Nonsense, James," she lied, her knees secretly trembling. "I had it entirely under control." Bill Wong approached Penelope, gently taking the leather folder from her hands. "Evidence, Mrs. Cartwright. But I assure you anything unrelated to the murders will remain strictly confidential. The village's secrets are safe." A collective silent sigh of relief swept through the onlookers. A week later, life in Carsely had returned to its usual rhythm, though the undercurrents had shifted. The vicar, having miraculously survived the poisoning, was back in his pulpit, delivering slightly more impassioned sermons about forgiveness. Penelope had closed up the manor, intending to sell it and return to London, leaving Agatha a very expensive bottle of champagne as a thank you. Agatha sat alone in her cottage, the champagne unopened on the kitchen island. Roy Silver had gone back to the city, complaining of boredom. She walked to the window and looked out across the pristine lawns toward James Lacey's house. His lights were on, but he hadn't called. She had won. She had solved the murder, outsmarted the killer, and secured her place as Carsely's resident saviour. Yet, as she stared out into the quiet country night, the old, familiar ache of loneliness crept in. The thrill of the chase was over, leaving her with nothing but her impeccable wardrobe and the quiet ticking of the hall clock. Agatha sighed, turning away from the window. She poured herself a generous measure of gin, squared her shoulders, and lifted her chin. Let James Lacey sit in his study. Let the village gossip. Agatha Raisin was alive, she was brilliant, and tomorrow she decided she would go to Evesham and buy a new pair of shoes. After all, one never knew when the next murder might require a quick getaway. Chapter 11. The Delphinium détente Agatha Raisin's new shoes were a spectacular mistake. They were cobalt blue, featured a viciously sharp stiletto heel, and had cost her a small fortune in an Evesham boutique. They were designed for gliding across marble floors or carpeted boardrooms, not for navigating the treacherous, spongy lawns of the Carsely Open Garden Day. By the time she reached Mary Debenham's prized herbaceous borders, Agatha's heels had aerated a good portion of the village green, and she was in a foul temper. The village, however, seemed to have reached a collective, unspoken agreement on how to handle the woman who had unmasked a murderer and dodged a bullet. They treated her with a mixture of profound respect and abject terror. It wasn't the warm, embracing acceptance Agatha had originally craved when she sold her PR firm, but to her surprise, she found she rather liked it. "Oh, Agatha dear," flustered Miss Sims, nearly dropping a plate of cucumber sandwiches as Agatha approached the refreshment tent. "Please step to the front of the queue. Can I get you tea? Earl Grey, or perhaps something stronger?" Tea is fine, Miss Sims, Agatha said smoothly, accepting the cup. She noticed that Mrs. Mason, the postmistress, was staring at her from behind a victorious sponge with wide, nervous eyes. The rumour mill had naturally concluded that since Agatha had been the one to retrieve the nightmare folder, she must have read its contents before handing it over to Sergeant Wong. Agatha hadn't read a single page. Of course, Sesh'd been entirely too busy running for her life, but she saw no reason to correct them. A little healthy fear was excellent for village compliance. She turned and found herself face to face with Mary Debenham. The spinster looked less sour than usual, though she was still eyeing Agatha's cobalt shoes with deep suspicion.
Oh. Aggressive this year, Mary, Agatha offered, trying for a compliment.
Mary stiffened, then gave a curt nod. Thank you, Agatha. And, well, I suppose I should thank you for the other night. With Arthur. And Meles. Mary lowered her voice, looking around nervously. The police assured me the folder was destroyed. Burned in the incinerator at Gloucester Station. So I hear, Agatha said, taking a sip of her tea. A shame, really. I imagine it made for fascinating reading. Mary swallowed hard and scurried away to check her prize-winning marrows. Agatha smiled into her teacup. It was petty, perhaps, but after being shot at in Mary's garden, she felt she was owed a little psychological warfare. Enjoying yourself, are we? Agatha's heart performed its usual, irritating gymnastics. James Lacey was standing beside a trellis of climbing roses, looking infuriatingly handsome in a casual linen shirt and rolled-up sleeves. Just admiring the local flora, James, Agatha said, carefully extracting her left heel from the mud with a soft schlup, and assessing the shift in the social wind. I believe I am currently the most feared woman in the Cotswolds. James laughed, a genuine warm sound that made Agatha want to forgive him for his maddening aloofness. You're certainly the most formidable. Though I imagine your dry cleaner is weeping over that crimson suit. It was a casualty of war, Agatha sniffed. She looked up at him, her PR bravado slipping just a fraction to reveal the vulnerable, hopeful woman underneath. It's quiet without Penelope and the drama, isn't it? Almost dull. Carsely is meant to be dull, Agatha. That's why we live here. James looked down at her, his blue eyes softening. But you certainly livened things up. I was thinking, perhaps when the dust has completely settled we might get dinner. At the Red Lion, or somewhere a bit further afield if you prefer. Agatha's pulse skyrocketed. Anakdwali bitashen. Not a neighbourly drink, not a crisis meeting dinner. I suppose I could check my diary. She lied flawlessly, her tone perfectly bored. I'm quite busy, but I might be able to squeeze you in. I'll hold you to it, James smiled, turning back toward the roses. Watch your step on the way out, Agatha. The grass is damp. Agatha walked back to her cottage, her feet screaming in agony, but she barely felt the pain. She had survived a murderer, secured her social standing through sheer intimidation, and finally wrangled a date out of the most stubborn bachelor in Gloucestershire. As she unlocked her front door, the silence of the empty house greeted her. Usually it would press down on her, a heavy reminder of her solitary life, but today it felt like a sanctuary. She kicked off the dreadful blue shoes, leaving them abandoned on the hallway rug, and padded into the kitchen to pour herself a generous measure of gin. She raised the glass to her reflection in the darkened kitchen window. She was Agatha Raisin. She was brash, she was brilliant, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. Let the village whisper let James Lacey take his time. If there was one thing Agatha had learned, it was that an ordinary life was entirely over Ratdan. She was uniquely equipped to handle the extraordinary. Chapter 12. The illusion of romance. Agatha's bed looked as though a high-end London boutique had violently exploded across the duvet. It was Friday evening, exactly 1 hour before James Lacey was due to pick her up, and she was in a state of advanced, terrifying panic. Oh! She stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, fiercely scrutinizing the emerald green silk wrap dress she had finally settled upon. It was expensive, sophisticated, and she hoped hid the slight thickening of her waist that came from too many of Mrs. Bloxby's sympathy scones. She applied her lipstick a shade called Vengeful Berry with the cold, calculated precision of a sniper. Tonight was the night, a real date. She had survived an acanatine-wielding maniac, stared down the barrel of a silver-plated pistol, and practically saved Carsely from social ruin, all to get James Lacey sitting across a table from her with romantic intent. When the doorbell finally rang, Agatha took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and opened the door with a practiced look of casual surprise, as if she hadn't been waiting by the peephole for 10 minutes. James looked devastatingly handsome in a charcoal blazer and an open-collared shirt. He smiled, a genuine warm expression that made Agatha's heart do a pathetic little flutter. "You look lovely, Agatha," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you, James." "I just threw this on," she lied flawlessly. He had booked a table at a very posh, very quiet French restaurant in the neighbouring village of Broadway. The lighting was dim, the waiter spoke in hushed, reverent tones, and the wine list required a small mortgage. It was exactly the sort of setting Agatha had dreamed of. Yet, as the evening progressed over scallops and a rather excellent chablis, Agatha found herself fighting a familiar, irritating sense of deflation. James was charming, certainly. He poured her wine, asked about her week, and listened politely, but the conversation remained resolutely pleasant. They discussed the weather, the upcoming parish council elections, and James' recent attempts to fix his garden wall. Agatha, craving the crackle of electricity, decided to steer the conversation back to her recent triumph. "I heard Penelope accepted an offer on the manor," Agatha remarked, slicing into her duck confit. "She's moving back to Chelsea. Can't say I blame her. The ghosts in that house are entirely too chatty." James paused, his fork resting on his plate. "It's for the best. Though I must admit, Agatha, Im's still entirely appalled by your behaviour that night. Charging into a locked room with a killer. You could have been shot." "I wasn't," Agatha said, lifting her chin, her pride instantly bristling. "I handled it. If I hadn't thrown that paperweight, he would have killed us both." "It was reckless," James insisted, his military background showing in the stern set of his jaw. "Brave, undeniably, but utterly reckless. Promise me you'll leave police work to Bill Wong in the future." Agatha took a slow sip of her wine, masking her irritation. She didn't want to be scolded like a disobedient subaltern, she wanted to be admired. She wanted him to reach across the table, take her hand, and declare her the most fascinating woman he had ever met. Instead, he was treating her like a volatile grenade that needed careful handling. "I make no promises, James," she said softly, but with a sharp edge. "I am who I am. I don't sit on the sidelines." A flicker of something amusement. Respect crossed James' cool blue eyes. "No, you certainly don't." The drive back to Carsely was quiet, wrapped in the comfortable, albeit slightly frustrating, silence of two people who were circling each other but refusing to land. When James walked her to her front door, the Cotswold air was sharp and cold. "Thank you, Agatha," James said, turning to face her on the porch. "It was a truly lovely evening." Agatha looked up at him, her heart thumping. This was the moment. James leaned in. Agatha closed her eyes, tilting her face upward. She felt the briefest, most polite brush of his lips against her cheek. "Good night, Agatha," he said softly, stepping back before she could even register the disappointment. He turned and walked down the path toward his own cottage, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. Agatha stood on the porch for a long moment, watching him go. She touched her cheek, letting out a breath that was half a sigh and half an exasperated groan. "Iceberg," she muttered to the empty street. She let herself inside, the silence of the cottage wrapping around her. She kicked off her heels, poured a generous measure of gin, and walked into the living room. She slumped onto the sofa, feeling the adrenaline and anticipation of the evening slowly drain away, leaving a familiar, hollow ache in its wake. But then, Agatha caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She saw the emerald dress, the perfect hair, the fierce, unyielding set of her shoulders. She had not won James Lacey's heart tonight, not entirely, but she had forced him to look at her. She had forced the entire village to respect her. She was Agatha Raisin, a woman who had clawed her way up from the gritty streets of Birmingham to the heights of London PR, and she had just outsmarted a cold-blooded killer. She took a sip of her gin, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. James Lacey would crack eventually, and in the meantime Carsely was her territory now. Agatha raised her glass to the empty room, to the quiet village, and to whatever beautifully inconvenient mystery dared to cross her path next.